whoever climbs up to the second story to get the banana there, everybody gets shocked. So not just the one that climbs up to the second floor, but everybody gets shocked. So very quickly, the monkeys will start punishing newcomers that try to climb up to the second story because they don't want to get shocked.
Hey everyone, in this episode, I interview Zhang to hear about his experiences working for Neuralink. A couple things to note about the structure of the episode are: one, the edits are made with the intent of improving the listener experience, and two, I think the questions become more and more interesting as the episode goes on, and I'm hoping that this will incentivize watching the entire way through. But if you're wanting to cheat the system, feel free to use the timestamps in the description. Hope you enjoy the episode. Hey everyone, welcome back to Neura Pod. For this week's episode, I'm really excited to have on Zhang. He's currently working at Seldom, but he's a former Neuralink full-time employee and was a microfabrication engineer. So I'm extremely excited to be having this conversation and interviewing him. I hope you guys are as well. So Han, do you mind introducing yourself a little bit and just giving some background for the folks who are listening?
Yeah, so I guess brief background. After graduation, I moved to the Bay Area and started working for a company called Neuralink, which I'm sure your audience knows about. There I worked as a microfabrication engineer or on the microfabrication team, but sort of as a mixed background engineer. I did some mechanical engineering, some electrical engineering, ran some experiments, and also some microfabrication as well. And then after that, I moved on to a smaller startup company, one that came out of the Illumina Accelerator. That company's name is Seldom, and that's where I currently work. And there I do similar skills, but for different applications. I build instruments and robotic systems for them. So very much still a mix of mechanical and electrical and software engineering. And then I can delve into my background before then as well.
Yeah, like a little bit of your involvement and your education at UBC.
Yeah, sounds good. So back when I was in school, I went to the University of British Columbia, and there I studied engineering physics. So this is sort of like a mixed program in the sense that it covers many different disciplines: physics, math, mechanical engineering, and electrical engineering, sort of are the four major components of it. And I did the mechatronics specialization and then also minored in mathematics. So that's sort of what I studied in university. And then extracurricular activities. Back then, I helped run the UBC Mars Colony Engineering team. Also did some international research opportunities in Germany, Singapore, and then helped also mentor incoming international students to the UBC campus.
That context is really nice and important to share because a lot of these steps, although they may seem like beginner steps, I think they're instrumental in, number one, even just getting the job, and then number two, like performing well in that job.
Yeah.
So do you mind sharing like how you think those two are related and what you think are some of the most important things that you learned from those experiences are that translated to doing a full-time job at Neuralink?
I think certainly the education is almost directly relevant because in engineering physics, you learn a lot about the fundamental physics concepts that directly apply to microfabrication. The mechanical engineering classes and electrical engineering classes sort of allow you to build tools that serve those purposes or goals that the microfabrication team is trying to achieve. So those are the directly applicable sort of classroom concepts and theory and knowledge that led me to Neuralink. But then on top of that, the engineering physics program is sort of particular and special in that it has a lot of hands-on components. So it has three major project courses. One is this sort of second-year robotics course that goes through all summer, and then they also have two capstone projects. So it really the program stresses not only a good sort of foundational theoretical understanding of scientific concepts, but also a lot of practiced experience with hands-on skills and applying that knowledge. So that helped me gain a lot of relevant project experience and engineering experience, which Neuralink directly found useful. Like there were many times during the interview process where they asked me to elaborate on past project work and They were curious about the past project work that I did. Neuralink is special in that it's a lot closer to a research organization than an industry, sort of your typical industry startup company. It has sort of very long-term goals, and that kind of makes it more like a research institute. And so a lot of the skills and experience that I gained working in these research institutes, building equipment for them, setting up experiments, running experiments, collecting data, and then inferring some sort of conclusion from that, that was also directly translatable to Neuralink. So that's sort of a long-winded explanation of how all that tied together to bring me to Neuralink.
One thing that I really want to do with the podcast is just try to inspire young folks and bring awareness to the possibilities that are out there with biotechnology, and basically showcase and demonstrate how much curiosity is needed in the space in order to make progress. It just feels like we know so little about the brain, but all these young folks that are potentially watching this or just going through school in some way, like I want them to realize, okay, there's all this stuff that the brain does, but there's still a lot that we don't know. And we're kind of like at a point where a lot of it is being discovered. So any words of inspiration or encouragement that you could provide for those young folks would be great.
Firstly, I mean, you're absolutely right. There's a lot that we are uncovering, but still much more space to go. I think there's like comparisons where like if all of the knowledge surrounding the human brain is like a mile-long strip, we would only have covered the first few inches of it. So there's a lot more work to be done, but just from what we know, right, about the brain, there's already so many different potential applications. And Neuralink is just one company that's working on these sort of applications, right? The ability to restore certain functionalities to people that are disabled or have experienced strokes or other sorts of damage to parts of their brain. Restoring functionality and even enhancing functionality. These are sort of the two main areas that applications fall under. If you look at those sci-fi movies, if you know about movies like The Matrix, these sort of futures actually aren't that impossible. Like a lot of the things that are presented in these sci-fi movies or shows like Black Mirror are in theory possible. And I think that that's something that's quite inspiring to me, is imagine if you could take the information from the brain and move it outside of the brain into some digital format and use it to control things or use it to keep a record of your thoughts, or even compare it to other people's thoughts in a much more high fidelity manner. So meaning that your thoughts are translated. There's some loss of information when you transfer thoughts through words. There's not a perfect translation between my thoughts to words. Some people are better at explaining their thoughts than others. And then there's also not a perfect fidelity when my words are heard by the opposing party, the other person, because whatever information I'm trying to present, they may understand the word's definitions slightly differently than I do, or they may picture something different. We may picture something different when we say the same word. So there's some loss of information there, and then you have to encode the verbal things that you hear into information in your brain. So that sort of chain process, and the losses along that chain make it so that verbal communication is actually inferior to many of the other potential forms of communication if you start to, really dive into biotechnology, especially like neurotechnology and neuroengineering. There's a lot of exciting things that can be done today by pairing our capacities in digital technologies and computation with the human brain.
Yeah, so like super exciting how much is out there, and
Yeah,
just want more people to be exposed to it.
right.
Um, okay, so I guess I'm curious about just talking more about Neuralink and your experience there. So you started in November 2018
18. Yeah. Yeah.
and then worked there for about a year.
Right.
Can you explain what you did as a microfabrication engineer?
When I was on the microfabrication team, I was one of the more, I think, generalist backgrounds. So My tasks varied quite widely. There was some microfabrication processes that I actually ran myself, and then I also did like chemical experiments, so building fluidics baths and playing around with different ways of metallization, forming sort of metal connector interconnects between the thin film electrodes and our actual silicon chips that do processing, mechanical engineering of jigs, and then a lot of PCB designs as well, and also flexible PCBs, and then some associated software to automate these sort of experiments.
Do you mind talking about the overall like pace of work at Neuralink and the exposure to leadership that you had while you were there?
Pace of work very fast. So yeah, Neuralink moves quite fast. I think that's similar to Tesla as well. Like a lot of Elon's companies are known for being fast paced. So one of the traits that they look for in individuals is mission oriented or mission first. So these are people that are very dedicated to the overall mission of the company, go-getter type of attitudes, right? Like if a problem comes up, you will find a way to overcome it or get around it. I think it also is a testament to the talent that the company has managed to collect. They have a lot of people that are able to, whenever they come up against a technical challenge, have the creativity and the flexibility and the resourcefulness and the tenacity to assemble resources to overcome that challenge. It's not like destructively fast paced where we're just like recklessly, breaking things, move fast and break things. Yeah, that slogan doesn't really apply, I would say, at Neuralink. That slogan is very much a software company slogan. A software company, a mistake in your own code can be usually fixed. You can run it, you can compile it, run it, test it, and in the test suite it fails. Okay, you've made a mistake somewhere. You can just go back and fix it. It's not really a high cost unless it actually rolls out. Okay, then it's a high cost, but there's many steps before that. In mechanical engineering, if you send out a part for manufacturing and it has an error in it, you can't really fix that very easily. You have to probably redesign it and then send it out for manufacturing again, and that costs a lot of money and then a lot of time as well in the manufacturer remanufacturing and then shipping it again. So the costliness of a single mistake is, I think, much higher as you move from software to hardware. And as a result, because Neuralink works on not just hardware but really fine, fragile hardware. We're talking about like nanofabrication or microfabrication, like very thin film electrodes. The costliness of a single mistake can be very high, and therefore, despite Neuralink moving at a fast pace, it's also very, especially in the microfabrication team, very meticulous and systematic in how it does its work.
Did you see that progress or change throughout your time at Neuralink? Like, I guess like the day you left, did you feel like the work environment was substantially different from the day that you joined?
In terms of the style of operation, the way we operated, that I think was fairly constant, at least within the microfabrication team. There was some team reorganizations, which is expected in a startup, but the microfabrication team I think was very consistent. It was very meticulous and systematic from the start when I was there, mainly due to the fact that like if you make an error in microfabrication, you send out, for example, a design and you get like a mask for lithography, and you made some errors in there. If you didn't even realize there was an error and you made like a bunch of wafers on it and then it showed up at the very end, that whole process could take like a month and then you would have to redo everything. It's very important that you don't make a mistake because that's a lot of time. 2 months or 1 month even is a lot of time.
I'm unfamiliar with what lithography is.
This is where you use light to write patterns onto usually some sort of material, photoresist, that is on a silicon wafer. And the whole point is that you start off with like a blank slab of silicon, usually in the form of a disk, which is usually referred to as a wafer. And then you're trying to write little features that are on the order of, it depends on your application, but nanometers or microns in the case of Neuralink. trying to pattern these sort of features onto the silicon. And then you're going to, after writing the features, you're going to take away some of the silicon. There's really three things that you do in microfabrication, right? There's patterning, where you write some sort of pattern, and then there's removal of material, etching, and then there's adding material, which is depositions. You just do those sort of three steps in different orders, and then you use different materials, and that's essentially how, in a nutshell, all of the microfabrication devices are made. It's just some combination of those three steps over and over again, and with different materials. And so the lithography part is one way that you can pattern, you can write patterns onto silicon. Litho, I think, means stone. Graphy meaning write, so writing into stone, and you do this with light, lasers, so that you can get very fine features, because you can, focus light down to nanometers today.
I'm curious if the robot that would perform an implant surgery would also do some of this type of etching or any of these processes.
So Neuralink's surgery robot is highly specialized for surgery, and
Okay.
that's basically the only thing it does. And when it comes to microfabrication, it's probably very similar to what other people would use if they did microfabrication. So there's sort of an industry standard for what tools are used. A whole bunch of companies that make these sort of microfabrication machinery. They're in a lot of university clean rooms. They're in a lot of actual silicon foundries, and it's pretty standard across industries. So Neuralink would likely use those.
These wafers are being used for the writing of information to the brain, or reading of information to the brain, or both?
Both. There's sort of two different areas that microfabrication comes in. One is making those electrodes that go into the brain. So that would be used for reading and writing. That's sort of what Neuralink does in-house, because those are very particular to Neuralink. But then there's also sort of silicon chips, specialized silicon chips that Neuralink makes for data processing from the electrodes. There's sort of two microfabrication components. One is the silicon threads, the other is the actual chip that reads and processes and cleans up information, and both of them are used in reading and writing.
So can you remind me some of the other things that you said you worked on?
Microfabrication processes, building like just random rigs and such for some mechanical engineering there, and then PCBs, designing PCBs for experiments, test situations, and then fluidics baths.
Can you elaborate on the printed circuit boards and the fluidics?
Because we make a lot of like electrode designs, right? And we want to, test what's the signal quality from these electrodes, what kind of, formulas work best, how long do they last? All of these are questions that we have to be able to answer about the electrodes that are made. The PCBs that I designed were to run through a whole bunch of electrical tests on these electrodes, testing their signal quality, resistance, variation, stuff like that. And then the fluidics baths, that was sort of when we were exploring how to make interconnects between silicon chips and thin film electrodes. There was many paths, and metallizing a certain material, and that had to be done in a fluidics bath. And so yeah, that was where I designed the built fluidics bath and carried some experiments and quantified like how much metallization was happening and how essentially the quality of the metallization on this material, if this would be a suitable interconnect between the silicon chip and the electrodes.
My instinct is that Neuralink generally has the biggest challenge that engineers and Neuralink has is centered around material science.
Yeah.
Do you think that's like the number one issue, or number one like science or engineering related problems that they have?
There are sort of like a whole bunch of problems where like any one of them would make this technology not work. So in that sense, they are all in the same tier of like, if this doesn't get solved, this whole thing doesn't work. For the robotics team, how to get robots to very precisely move to a target on the brain and insert an electrode, because the brain is not a still object. The brain actually pulsates a little bit as you breathe. being able to, in real time, detect the movement of the surface of the brain and compensate for that and being able to insert electrode, that's certainly a challenge. Adjacent challenge to that would be being able to spot blood vessels in the brain and avoid those. Obviously, you don't want to puncture one of those if you're inserting a electrode. On the electrical engineering side, you're moving a lot of information, right? So you're reading from thousands of electrodes. Depending on the design, it could be tens of thousands of electrodes, or more. If you're reading from that many electrodes, and you want this device to sort of be compact and sit on someone's head, you're going to have to come up with a very clever silicon chip to be able to process that information, digitize it because it comes as analog signals from the electrodes, digitize it, and not be very power hungry. Because if you are very power hungry, it's going to heat up that local region of the brain, and at best it'll be uncomfortable, and at worst it could actually cook tissue. So that's a problem. And I'm not saying that that's an actual problem we've run into. I'm just saying this is in general something that you have to be cognizant of. Pretty much on any domain, any team or domain that Neuralink touches on, there's big challenges in those domains. And so, yeah, going back to microfabrication and material science, yeah, like you say, different materials have conductivity issues, stress and strain issues. You want these things to be flexible, so you're bending it. So you have to make sure that you choose materials that won't, for example, over time, if you bend it too many times, or if it moves back and forth, it hardens more, or it just breaks. So you don't want something super brittle. You have to worry about things like corrosion, because there's a lot of different chemicals floating around in the brain. You have ions, you have proteins, you have like a whole bunch of different things, and your material that your electrodes are made out of has to be able to survive in that environment for years, and not only survive but also carry the same signal quality through all that time. You don't want it to drift, so it can't. Not only does it have to survive, it has to remain relatively constant in form factor and electrical properties. And then at the same time, it has to be feasible to manufacture. So that also cuts down on the number of options. And then also not only feasible to manufacture, but it has to work well, play nicely with the surgery robot. Right. So you're sort of constrained there with like the types of designs that you can do that a robot can interface with, because it's not a surgeon that will be peeling these electrodes and sticking them in the brain. They're too small, and obviously you want to automate this eventually. So you have to design it in a way that a robot can, actually manipulate it physically. So yeah, those are big challenges there. And then on the software side, right, you get all this data stream from the brain. It just looks like a bunch of I don't know if you've ever looked at these like neural recordings, but it just looks like a whole many channels of like almost a flat line, but there's like clearly something happening there, like little spikes here and there. So how do you then make sense of that information? First off, you have to be able to take this raw data stream and be able to pick out when a neuron is firing. And that's already harder than one might expect, because, if you see what looks like a spike, how do you know that that's a spike versus your electrode just being degraded during surgery, for example, during implantation? Maybe it was stretched too much or damaged in some way. How do you know that that's not a signal issue or a noise issue rather than an actual genuine spike? So you have to have some software to be able to decide on that. And then after you decide it's a spike, how do you know that this is one spike from a nearby neuron versus like many spikes happening in the general background vicinity of the brain? So again, none of the things I'm saying are necessarily challenges that Neuralink is facing. I'm just saying that these are general things that are challenges when you're attempting something like a BMI. After you pick out what are spikes, then is the real hard problem, which is like, what do these spikes mean? How do you make meaningful information out of just random spikes on 3,000 channels? Like, what does a single neuron firing really even mean? It doesn't necessarily mean anything in and of itself. It's really the combinations of neurons firing that really gives you a lot more information. So using machine learning algorithms and stuff like that to be able to decode meaning from trains of neural data, that's also a huge challenge. And then that's only the engineering side, right? Then there's the biology side. The brain has like immune response system, it has scarring effects. It's an organ. It's not really meant to have things implanted into it. All of these things produce a lot of challenges with like, for example, if scar tissue forms, then the live neurons get pushed away from the site of implantation. Potentially, that could cause signal issues, immune responses, or you may have weird things caking onto your electrode. I'm just throwing things out there that could be potential challenges. Obviously, surgery is not a trivial thing to do. So you have to make sure that you do that part right and not cause substantial risk to any patient that might be undergoing the surgery.
So I guess in summary, like there are huge challenges ahead, and some that they're currently like working through.
A lot of the ones that I mentioned, they've actually already addressed and are no longer serious challenges. But I bring it up because it's something to think about, just to illustrate how monumental of a challenge Neuralink is even attempting. Neuralink is one of those companies that is working on something that has challenges on so many different fronts. Any one of those challenges not working can torpedo the whole idea. This is really quite a feat. Like if they pull this off, it would be quite a accomplishment, because of just the not only the quantity but also the magnitude of the challenges that they're facing.
Can you explain the specific difference between the electrodes, the threads, and the channels?
A thread looks like it's like a single polymer thing that you can't really separate. And within a thread, there are many electrodes. So there are many sort of independent electrical paths within a single polymer thread. So one thread will carry many electrodes. There's many electrical pathways along that thread, and they terminate at different lengths along the thread, which means when that thread is implanted into the brain, those electrodes will sit at different depths in the brain. And so they will be hopefully reading from different neurons. So that's the difference between thread and electrode. And then typically, what we call a channel is like basically correlates to one electrode. So we read from all of the electrode sites. And so each uh, channel is just one reading, one signal train from one electrode.
Gotcha. And each of those channels is read and write capable.
There are ones that are read and write capable, and there are ones that are read capable. The eventual goal is to have both working.
If you had to describe what Neuralink's end product or service is, how would you describe what it is?
I think that there's like the super long-term goal, being able to digitize human consciousness, being able to control anything digital with your thoughts. I think in the sort of shorter term, next 5, 10, sort of 20 years, that sort of time frame. In our lifetimes, I guess, for sure in our lifetimes, I think we will see products that enable people who might have lost some functionality in the brain to be able to recover those lost functionalities and to be able to control computers, other sort of digital devices with their thoughts directly through the brain, and do that relatively well, like comparatively to a fully functioning adult, or even better.
Do you think
Yeah.
it's possible that in the future Neuralink or some other company comes up with a way to use the information that they've been receiving to basically like train a neural net to eventually create like an artificial brain?
Just talking about BMI, brain machine interfaces in general, I definitely think personally, it's my personal opinion, that that is the way that things will go, where we start making artificial brains. If you can digitize thoughts, and if you can record information, let's just say we get to the point where we're able to record information from all parts of the brain with very high fidelity. We can basically map meaning and thoughts from the brain with very high accuracy, right? It's very natural for me to imagine the next step being just building artificial brains, and general intelligences that are based off of human brains. You might be making it from scratch, or you may even just be copying over someone's consciousness into a digital format. I think both of those are possibilities in the future, and I think that that's probably where BMI in general, like the whole industry, not Neuralink in particular, necessarily, but the industry in particular will definitely be headed in that way. And which companies end up doing this? It may be a company that doesn't even exist today, but it also might also be Neuralink or some other company in that space.
It's fascinating to me, like how much the brain is able to do with such little energy versus like the world's biggest supercomputer or whatever. It's like
Yeah.
requires tons of energy.
Yeah, the brain is definitely a very fascinating object. Who was it that said it's like the most informationally dense thing in the known universe? Something along those lines. But yeah, it is very impressive. That's why we study it. And the question really that I have in my mind that I'm not sure what the answer to this is like, can you ever get to something that is informationally more dense or compact electronically, digitally, compared to the brain? And would that ever be more energy efficient than the brain? Like not necessarily the human brain, but basically the question is like, suppose you had a set of organic chemicals to play with, and then another set of like silicon and metal atoms to play with, and you tried making brains out of these two Lego sets. Which Lego set at the end of the day would produce the most energy efficient computational device? Which one can produce the most informationally dense? And then which one can produce the best brain off of a combination of those two metrics, information dense and also energy efficient? And I'm not really sure personally which one of the two it would be, if it would be a biological system or a silicon metal sort of system.
With Neuralink, like the information that's being moved around in the brain is through electric signals and chemical signals
Yeah,
too, right?
right.
So how do you foresee like future interactions with medical like drugs with the physical like electrical signals being read and written from the brain with Neuralink?
I think that Neuralink is probably not going to be doing anything on the drug side of things. Maybe they will. I'm not sure. The future is very much, dependent on progress the company makes, and it has a very large exploratory arm. There's a lot of things that are very research-like in Neuralink, so very exploratory. We know there are things that's what it means to take drugs, right? Like colloquially, there are drugs and chemicals that will affect the way the brain works, and some of them are therapeutic. And so I think more and more you're going to see an industry pop up around drug therapies to address mental health issues, mental disorders, other sorts of irregularities with brain function. That should be getting more and more sophisticated because right now, okay, for example, painkillers, right? You just take a bunch of painkillers and you just flood your brain with opiates, and that's how you kill the pain sensors. But perhaps there's a better way of doing that without triggering the addiction pathway in the brain. So I would expect drugs in the future to be much more sophisticated and be able to do certain things without triggering a whole bunch of negative side effects.
So at the end of the 2020 update event, they did like a roundtable in the room. They asked the same question of everybody, like, what's the thing you're most excited about for Neuralink working on in the future? What would be your thing?
I think for me, it would probably be the ability to digitize the brain. So just upload my consciousness or some sort of digital equivalent to my brain onto the cloud, and then be able to in a sense free myself from this biological body. Not that I have any problems with my particular body, but the ability to like download my consciousness into any particular body anywhere is something that is really amazing, like inspiring as an idea, right? The ability to say if I wanted to download myself into a drone and fly around, or a submarine and swim around, or if I wanted to visit Mount Everest and climb to the peak, rather than doing that in a human body, just literally port myself over to some stationary fixed robot planted on the peak of Mount Everest and just like look around, or live stream people's thoughts and experiences directly to my consciousness. from wherever they are in the world. Freedom from the biological form is, I think, probably what I'm most looking forward to. But this is like way in the future.
That's a cool answer.
Yeah, and then there's other cool things like human hive minds, for example, that can come about. So that's a whole another thing as well. That would be very interesting. These sort of super organisms that can form once you allow like an internet or a network of human brains.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it'll be cool to like have all of them basically connected in some way or another.
Yeah, basically, and it gets dystopian very fast because it's like, well, there's sort of emergent phenomena when you connect things, right? There's like, I don't know if you've ever heard of this experiment where like they have like 4 chimps and then or 4 monkeys, and then like if a monkey goes up into a second, there's like a 2-story environment, and if they climb up to the second story to get a banana there, they get shocked. And if they get banana on the first floor, everything's fine. They slowly replace these monkeys one by one. Whoever climbs up to the second story to get the banana there, everybody gets shocked. So not just the one that climbs up to the second floor, but everybody gets shocked. So very quickly, the monkeys will start punishing newcomers that try to climb up to the second story because they don't want to get shocked. And eventually, when you replace all 4 monkeys one at a time, so that there's some ability for the other 3 to teach the newcomer not to do that, when you replaced all 4 original monkeys and you take away the shock mechanism, they still punish every monkey from going to the second floor, even though there's no cost to it anymore. So these sort of like network effects that happen from different independent agents inflicting punishment or reward on each other in an environment of imperfect information and assumptions. There can be a lot of emergent phenomena that are very dystopian, very unexpected, and very persistent that have nothing to do with truth or anyone's individual beliefs. There's a lot of very interesting, both potentially very dangerous and potentially very rewarding things, I think, in the future for BMI.
Yeah, that story like perfectly illustrates like what, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for having this conversation. I'm sure like everybody's looking forward to it.
Yeah, sounds good.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks for doing this, and hopefully we can talk again sometime soon.
Yeah, looking forward to it. All right.
Thanks for listening. Please subscribe, hit the bell notification icon, and follow us on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and Medium for updates and highlight clips. Hope to see you at the next episode.